Okay, real talk, just quickly. The last time I made one of these was a while ago, because shortly afterwards my channel kind of blew up from some other videos, so if you hear from them, the Marvel stuff or the TV analysis, don't worry, more of that is coming in a couple of days. But some of my earliest subscribers and viewers were from these videos I made on CSGO, so even though I'm fully aware this will not be a well-performing video by comparison, I am going to try to keep doing stuff like this too, every now and then. And if you've never watched one of these before, or if you don't even know what this game is, then give me a chance. This video might interest you. Anyway, that's it for Real Talk. Roll the intro. Counter-Strike Global Offensive is a game about terrorism and counter-terrorism. Nefarious forces who attempt to blow up buildings and landmarks or kidnap innocents, and the heroic soldiers and law enforcement squads that try to stop them. Or is it? Consider DE Bank, a demolition map where the terrorist team is actually a crime squad called the Professionals, and their target is a bank safe. Doesn't sound like terrorism to me. This begs the question, what other stories are hiding behind CSGO's quick and easy terrorist counter-terrorist designations, and are they all as morally black and white as they seem? In this series, I'll attempt to answer that, looking at map settings, agent models, and matching them to real-world history and geography. Welcome to Counter-Strike Global Forensics. Today we're going to be figuring out the backstory of Mirage, and this isn't going to be anywhere near as tricky as the ones we've done already. Just looking around the map, we see overtly Moroccan-esque architecture and a street sign written in Arabic and French. Some people think Mirage is in the Middle East because of the general aesthetic, but I think the architecture of buildings like Palace, as well as language hints like this sign, are more convincing indicators than the general look. But why is a sign in French and Arabic important? Well, if we presume this is Morocco, the sign fits in perfectly from a linguistic point of view. While the most common languages in Morocco are Arabic dialects, French is a second language for roughly a third of Moroccans, as a remnant of the country's colonial past. Alright, so Mirage is probably in Morocco, that's one part of the puzzle. But why is there conflict between these so-called terrorists and the CTs? Well, Mirage was added to the game in 2013. The level design had been present in a previous map called Strike, but the version we know and love today, in all its Moroccan glory, was implemented in 2013. And what had just concluded in Morocco at that point? Well, I'm glad you asked. Shortly before Mirage's release, Morocco had seen a wave of protests, growing out of the general North African and Middle Eastern period of discontent known as the Arab Spring. The Arab Spring was a wave of protests and uprisings across the north of Africa and the Middle East, generally between 2010 and 2012, caused by a growing discontent primarily among these societies' young as well as union members. Wage stagnation, corruption, human rights violations, and many other factors led to this discontent, and its after effects are still being felt across the region and indeed the world, including the current mess in Syria. Sorry, Syria, but it's kind of true. Unlike places like Tunisia or Egypt, the resultant protests in Morocco didn't lead to an all-out regime change, but it did lead to some governmental changes, such as the adoption of a constitution. These protests got a bit leery, there was some amount of rioting, and one guy even set himself on fire. But, and this is a big but, we never saw anything on the scale we do in Mirage. No bombs, no shootout with police or counter-terrorism forces as far as I can tell. So if this is the case, what's going on in this map? Well, the governmental changes which the Morocco protests led to were sort of an olive branch to the increasingly fed up protesters. They didn't stop things, as protests continued for months afterwards, but I do think it's possible that they kept things from getting any worse, as they would do in other North African countries. I think it's possible that these gestures of reform on the part of Morocco's rulers didn't happen in the timeline which Mirage takes place in, and that instead the government refused to listen, doubling down on the repression and brutality. As a result, the riots became more frequent and more violent, until one day guns and C4 entered the fray. If this is the case, we can try to narrow down Mirage's geography even more. It's almost certainly in one of Morocco's major cities where the Arab Spring protests were concentrated. So places like Rabat, Tangier, Marrakesh, Casablanca, and Fez. After a few minutes on Google Maps, I feel like Marrakesh or Casablanca are maybe the best visual matches for Mirage, but there's not much street view imagery in Morocco, so it could really be any old urban centre in the country. The player models of each team fit this scenario too. The counter-terrorist skins and voice lines on this map are by default the SAS, a British squad that on the surface of things really have no business fighting Moroccan rebels. But it makes sense when you remember that, as I mentioned in my video on Inferno, which you can see by clicking in the corner now, the SAS have been used in various NATO campaigns since World War II. Morocco isn't a member of NATO, but they are a designated major non-NATO ally of the US, and moreover, they have cooperated with NATO directly for many years. So I don't think it's much of a stretch to presume that if threatened by rebellion and possible civil war, the Moroccan government could look to NATO for help, who would maybe want to help Morocco get it under control to avoid it from turning into a proxy war or a puppet state for any of their enemies. The T's are the elite crew models, and this is fine. These are CSGO's generic Middle Eastern North African rebels with voice lines about, reclaiming their lands and such. These lines don't make much sense if they're just rebelling against their government, but if the SAS and therefore NATO are occupying cities on behalf of the government, it starts to make sense. So here's my pitch for what we're seeing play out in Mirage. It's the start of the 2010s, and ignited by growing social and economic problems, the Arab Spring has seen waves of protests spread across the southern Mediterranean. Some countries have reformed, but in this world, Morocco is not one of them. Instead, the police crack down more and more forcefully on calls for change. Anger and frustration grow in response, and as news of rebellion and regime change from elsewhere in the Arab world trickles in, the most hardline of the reformists take up arms after seeing their comrades beat and killed for the crime of trying to build a more fair society. This is the only way change can come, they think. This movement is concentrated in Morocco's urban centres, and as the government calls upon NATO forces to put a violent end to the reformist factions, somewhere in an old Moroccan city, which still bears the scars of French colonialism, the people fight back against what's perceived as a neo-imperial authoritarian crackdown. By destroying the government supplies held in a local market, as well as the palace symbolic of the decadent state, they hope to drive away these invaders, in order to be able to make their country a better place. But these forces, they're already here, and they only speak one language. So that's what I think's going on in Mirage. Are these terrorists? Yes. Is their violence justified? Maybe not. But is it more understandable than you might have thought at first glance? That's the question, isn't it? But if you've made it to the end, I'd love to know what you thought, and if you want to see more of these every now and then. Until then, regular content shall resume shortly, and that's all from me. Ta-ta!